Prophecy is not given to entertain curiosity, but to awaken urgency. It was never meant to be treated like a puzzle for the mind to solve just to feel clever or informed. Its purpose has always been to stir the heart, to shake us out of apathy, and to call us into alignment with something greater than ourselves. Prophecy points beyond information, it points toward transformation. It whispers that what is unfolding in front of us is not an accident, that there is intention woven into the fabric of time, and that each of us has a role to play when the signs begin to emerge. When we treat prophecy as mere curiosity, we reduce it to a spectacle. But when we approach it with reverence, we understand that it is a call to readiness. Every pattern that repeats across history is more than coincidence. Patterns are silent signals, not random events. They show us that humanity often walks in circles, stumbling over the same mistakes, chasing the same illusions, and paying the same price. Nations rise and fall in predictable rhythms because they forget the lessons of the past. Empires collapse not suddenly but slowly, as repeating behaviors hollow them out. Families, communities, and even individuals can trace cycles that seem unbreakable, until someone chooses to break them. Prophecy is a spotlight that reveals those patterns and warns us where they lead if ignored. It does not exist to predict lottery numbers or satisfy intellectual debates. It exists to reveal truths about human nature and divine timing. When you recognize these repeating signals, you realize that every warning is an invitation. It is not about fear, it is about awareness. The real danger is not that we don't see what is happening, but that we see and dismiss it as ordinary. Prophecy demands urgency because it knows complacency is humanity's most subtle trap. The moment we grow comfortable with compromise, with distraction, with division, the cycle accelerates. By the time the consequences become obvious, the patterns have already done their work. That is why prophecy insists on urgency, not tomorrow, not someday, but today. Curiosity can keep you entertained, but urgency keeps you prepared. Curiosity wants to know the when of prophecy, urgency wants to know the what now. One looks for dates, the other looks for direction. One waits passively for events to unfold, the other asks how to live differently now. The more we ignore the signals, the louder they become, and the more costly the lessons that follow. Prophecy presses on us because time is not an endless resource. It tells us that windows of opportunity do not last forever, that choices carry consequences, and that vigilance is the price of freedom. It is not about satisfying speculation, but about igniting responsibility. What repeats itself is never coincidence, it's a message. Life has a way of echoing lessons until we finally pay attention. The same arguments resurface, the same obstacles return, the same temptations reappear, not because the universe enjoys tormenting us, but because there is something we have not yet learned, something we have not yet changed. When cycles repeat, they are not accidents, they are reminders. Every pattern carries within it a voice, a signal that points to what must be addressed. In history, nations that ignore these signals always pay the price. Economic crashes, wars, corruption, and social decay do not happen overnight. They grow from repeated patterns that were dismissed as normal. What feels familiar may feel safe, but familiarity can also blind us to danger. If a system keeps breaking, if leaders keep abusing power, if fear keeps being used as a tool of control, it is not a series of random misfortunes. It is a message screaming to those who are awake enough to listen. The same is true in our personal lives. If you find yourself stuck in the same kind of toxic relationships, facing the same financial struggles, or wrestling with the same inner battles, it is not coincidence. It is a mirror being held up to you. Until you change the way you think, until you shift your choices, the cycle will continue to spin. Repetition is the world's way of underlining a lesson you keep skipping over. What repeats is designed to awaken you. It's a call to awareness, a push toward growth, an invitation to finally step out of the circle. Ignoring the message only guarantees the lesson will come back louder, harsher, and harder. Recognizing it, however, gives you the chance to break free, because nothing in life keeps showing up without reason. If it repeats, it's not coincidence, it's a message meant for you to hear. Global patterns often start small but grow loud. At first they whisper, a subtle change here, a quiet shift there, almost invisible to those too distracted by daily routines. A new idea, a small habit, a minor compromise. It doesn't seem significant. But what begins as a faint signal slowly builds into a chorus that shapes nations, economies, and cultures. Nothing loud begins loud. The most powerful movements, both constructive and destructive, begin as unnoticed patterns that grow in strength until they become impossible to ignore. History proves this truth over and over. Every great collapse began with small cracks. Corruption doesn't start as full-blown scandal. It begins with minor dishonesty tolerated as normal. Division doesn't begin as war. It begins as careless words, unchecked bitterness, small groups pitted against one another until the noise drowns out unity. Likewise, every great awakening has also begun with something quiet, a handful of voices speaking truth, a group of people daring to stand for what matters, a movement of courage that seemed insignificant until it ignited transformation. The same principle plays out in our personal lives. Small habits compound. Neglecting health, ignoring discipline, or allowing resentment to grow may feel harmless in the moment, but patterns magnify over time. A little compromise repeated becomes a lifestyle. A small spark of anger, left unchecked, becomes a wildfire of broken relationships. But the opposite is also true. Tiny acts of kindness ripple outward. Small commitments build unshakable strength. Quiet daily discipline creates unstoppable momentum. What seems small today becomes the loudest force tomorrow. That is why paying attention matters. Global patterns reveal themselves in the seeds long before the harvest. If you wait until the noise is deafening, it's often too late to change its course. The wise are not those who react to what's already loud. They are the ones who discern the whispers while others are still asleep. To recognize a growing pattern early is to step into power, to prepare before the storm, to lead before the crowd. Nothing spreads without roots. Nothing dominates the world without first dwelling in the unnoticed corners of life. Whether it's a destructive trend threatening freedom or a movement of courage capable of reshaping the future, it always begins small. The challenge is not whether patterns exist. The challenge is whether we are awake enough to hear them before they grow too loud to ignore. Fear disguises itself as normal until you question it. It slips in quietly, hiding beneath routines, decisions, and excuses, convincing you that it's just the way things are. It doesn't come with a warning label. Instead, it clothes itself in phrases like "I'm just being realistic," or "this is how everyone lives," or "maybe it's not the right time." Fear is clever. It doesn't announce itself as fear. It presents itself as logic, safety, and common sense. And because of this disguise, it becomes one of the most powerful forces that shape our lives without us even noticing. Think about how often fear dictates choices. People stay in jobs they hate because fear convinces them security is better than risk. They silence their voices because fear tells them speaking up will cost too much. They delay dreams for years because fear whispers that failure would be too humiliating. Over time, fear doesn't even feel like fear anymore, it feels like normal life. That's the trap. When enough people make decisions based on fear, a fearful culture becomes the standard. But the moment you begin to question it, everything shifts. Ask yourself, what would I do if fear weren't in charge? That simple question exposes the disguise. Suddenly, you see how many of your limits aren't real. They're inherited, passed down by parents, peers, or a society that quietly normalized shrinking back. The fear you thought was protection reveals itself as a prison. And here's the truth. Questioning fear doesn't mean recklessly ignoring wisdom. It means separating what is genuinely wise from what is secretly fear wearing wisdom's mask. Growth never feels normal at first. Courage rarely feels comfortable. Change will always come with resistance. But when you peel back the disguise and recognize fear for what it really is, you regain the power to choose. The greatest shift happens not when fear disappears, but when you stop letting it masquerade as normal. Because once you see it for what it is, you can no longer pretend you don't. The same cycle repeats until someone breaks it. Life, history, even personal struggles, all of them move in circles. Patterns don't stop on their own, they continue until they are interrupted with intention. That's why families often carry the same struggles across generations, why nations stumble into the same mistakes as their ancestors, and why individuals feel trapped in battles they thought they had already fought. Cycles don't care about your desire to be free. They care about your willingness to act differently. Look closely at history, and you'll see this truth everywhere. Civilizations collapse in the same predictable ways: corruption, division, greed, because no one steps in early enough to break the cycle. Wars repeat because pride and hatred remain unchallenged. Economies rise and fall in familiar rhythms because short-term gain blinds leaders to long-term consequences. Unless someone chooses to stand against the current continues. The same is true in our personal lives. If you notice yourself facing the same kind of heartbreak, the same financial struggles, or the same emotional battles, it is not coincidence. It is a cycle asking to be broken, and breaking it rarely begins with something dramatic. It starts with a single decision to stop repeating what has always been repeated, to forgive where bitterness has always been inherited, to save where debt has always been normal, to speak truth where silence has always been safer. Cycles thrive on silence and passivity. They gain strength from people who say, "This is just the way it is." But cycles weaken the moment someone dares to ask, "Does it have to be this way?" The courage to challenge what has always been accepted is the first step to freedom. And often the one who breaks the cycle doesn't just change their own life, they shift the future for everyone who follows them. The same cycle repeats until someone breaks it, and the power to break it has never belonged to time, to chance, or to luck. It has always belonged to the one who finally decides, enough. What you tolerate becomes the new standard. Life rarely changes by what we desire, it changes by what we allow. Every time you accept less than you deserve, every time you stay silent when you should speak, every time you permit something that goes against your values, you are unconsciously setting the bar for what becomes normal. Tolerance may feel harmless in the moment, but over time it becomes the invisible line that defines the culture of your life, your relationships, and even your world. In personal life, this truth is unavoidable. If you tolerate disrespect, it grows. If you tolerate dishonesty, it multiplies. If you tolerate mediocrity in yourself, it becomes your ceiling. You don't even have to agree with the wrong. You just have to ignore it long enough for it to settle in as the new baseline. And once it does, raising that standard again requires even greater effort, because comfort is contagious. History echoes this lesson. Societies rarely collapse from one sudden moment of corruption or injustice. They decline slowly because the people begin to tolerate what was once unthinkable. One small compromise becomes another, and soon what was considered outrageous is now considered ordinary. The laws change to reflect it, the culture adjusts to defend it, and the standard quietly shifts. The same principle applies in leadership. If a leader tolerates laziness, it spreads. If they tolerate division, it deepens. If they tolerate fear-driven decisions, it becomes the operating system of the entire structure. But the opposite is also true. What you refuse to tolerate also becomes the new standard. When you demand honesty, you invite integrity. When you set boundaries, you create respect. When you raise the bar for yourself and those around you, others rise to meet it. Change doesn't begin with everyone. It begins with someone who decides that tolerating less is no longer acceptable. Every tolerated excuse, every ignored injustice, every accepted limitation is silently shaping the future. Standards don't stay still. They rise or fall depending on what you permit. The moment you realize that what you allow is what you live, you understand the power you hold. The world doesn't only change because of what you fight against. It changes because of what you refuse to tolerate. Complacency is the enemy of awareness. Nothing blinds the human spirit more than the belief that everything is fine, when in reality, everything is quietly shifting beneath the surface. Complacency is not rest. It is stagnation disguised as peace. It lulls us into comfort, convinces us that growth is optional, and whispers that vigilance is unnecessary. And by the time its spell is broken, the damage is already done. In life, complacency shows up when we stop paying attention. It's when a relationship falls apart not because of one big betrayal, but because both people stop noticing the small distances growing between them. It's when health deteriorates not from one choice, but from hundreds of quiet compromises stacked over time. It's when opportunities slip away because someone assumed tomorrow would look just like today. Complacency kills not with noise, but with silence. History shows us the same truth on a larger scale. Nations rarely collapse in a single moment. They erode slowly as complacency spreads. When citizens stop questioning, when leaders stop listening, when people believe freedom or prosperity will last forever without vigilance, awareness fades. By the time the cracks become obvious, complacency has already eaten through the foundation. Awareness, on the other hand, requires discipline. It requires asking hard questions, noticing subtle shifts, and refusing to assume that comfort means security. Complacency also thrives in success. The moment we achieve a milestone, the temptation is to settle, to relax, to assume the work is over. But success is fragile. Businesses fail because leaders stop innovating. Dreams die because their owners stop pursuing them with the same hunger they had in the beginning. Growth is never automatic. It must be guarded. Awareness is what keeps momentum alive, but complacency convinces us momentum will carry itself. To fight complacency, you don't need paranoia. You need attentiveness. You need to ask yourself, am I awake? Am I noticing the changes around me? Am I still moving forward, or am I silently standing still? Because the greatest danger is not when you are struggling. The greatest danger is when you think you don't have to try anymore. Complacency is the enemy of awareness because it blinds you to the truth while convincing you that you already see. And the moment you trade awareness for comfort, you stop living on purpose and start drifting into patterns that will one day demand a price. Those who spot patterns early lead the change. The world doesn't reward those who simply react to what is obvious. It rewards those who recognize what is coming while it's still invisible to everyone else. By the time a pattern becomes undeniable, most people are already swept into its momentum. The true leaders, the ones who shape history and transform cultures, are those who notice the subtle shifts before they become headlines, who sense the undercurrent while others are distracted by the surface. Every great innovator, every movement that transformed society began with someone who saw what others ignored. The Wright brothers noticed a pattern in nature, the way birds tilted their wings to glide, and they transformed it into human flight. Leaders who anticipated technological revolutions acted when others dismissed the internet, electricity, or even the printing press as trivial. In every case, the advantage belonged not to the strongest or the wealthiest, but to those who had the vision to spot patterns before they became obvious. The same principle applies in personal life. If you notice recurring frustrations in your relationships, finances, or habits, you have the chance to change them before they spiral. Most people wait until the damage is unbearable to act, until their health fails, until their career collapses, until their relationships fracture. But those who act when the warning signs are still small take control of their future. They don't wait for the fire alarm. They notice the smoke and move. Patterns, once visible, are powerful teachers. They tell you where you're headed long before you arrive. They reveal whether you are building momentum toward growth or sliding slowly toward decline. Leaders, dreamers, and visionaries are not different because they are smarter. They are different because they are attentive. They listen to the whispers before they turn into roars. They trust the signals others dismiss. And here's the truth: you don't have to predict the future to lead change. You only have to notice the present with sharper eyes than the people around you. Because when you see the pattern early, you gain time to prepare, time to pivot, time to build what others will only realize when it's too late. Those who ignore patterns become victims of change. Those who spot them early become the ones who lead it. Ignoring signals today builds crises tomorrow. Life always whispers before it shouts. The cracks always appear before the collapse. The warning signs are always there, subtle, quiet, almost ignorable, long before the full weight of the crisis arrives. But because they are easy to overlook, most people do. They tell themselves the problem is too small, that it will fix itself, or that there's no need to act just yet. And so the small signals grow louder, the patterns strengthen, and what could have been prevented with awareness becomes a disaster that demands survival. History is full of proof. Every economic crash has its signs long before the markets fall. Every war is preceded by tension, division, and unchecked aggression. Every revolution is born from years of ignored discontent. When leaders dismiss these early warnings, they don't avoid the crisis, they guarantee it. A society that overlooks corruption, normalizes injustice, or tolerates division is not avoiding collapse, it is scheduling it. The cost of ignoring today's signals always shows up tomorrow in multiplied form. This principle is just as true in personal life. Health rarely fails overnight. It breaks down from years of ignoring signals. Relationships rarely end suddenly. They erode slowly from neglected conversations, unspoken frustrations, and small acts of distance. Dreams rarely die in one moment. They fade because signals of discipline, focus, or urgency were ignored day after day. What feels harmless now becomes a crisis later. The tragedy is that most crises could have been prevented if the early signals had been taken seriously. A cough ignored becomes an illness. A small debt becomes bankruptcy. A pattern of silence becomes emotional distance too wide to cross. Signals are not there to annoy us. They are there to protect us. They are the invitations to act while action still costs little. By the time the crisis arrives, the cost has multiplied. Awareness is not paranoia. It is responsibility. It is the ability to say, this small thing matters. This small signal is a warning. Because the truth is simple. Ignoring signals doesn't make them disappear. It only gives them permission to grow. And what grows unchecked today will become tomorrow's storm, demanding payment in pain, loss, or regret. Awareness is power. Action is freedom. Awareness is the first spark, the moment your eyes open and you finally see what was hidden in plain sight. It's the realization that the patterns around you are not coincidences, that the signals you've ignored have been speaking all along, and that life has been quietly preparing you to notice. Awareness is the power to name what is wrong, to identify what is broken, and to recognize what must change. Without awareness, you walk blindly into cycles that repeat, crises that grow, and traps that tighten. Awareness shines the light, and in that light, truth is exposed. But awareness alone is not enough. To know and not act is to chain yourself with knowledge that could have set you free. That's where action comes in. Action is the translation of power into freedom. It is the moment you refuse to keep living the same way after seeing what you now know. It is the step that interrupts the cycle, that redirects the story, that transforms awareness into something tangible. Action is never comfortable. It demands risk, discipline, courage, and sacrifice. But every act of courage expands your freedom because it loosens the grip of fear, complacency, and compromise. Think about it. Countless people are aware of their unhealthy habits, toxic relationships, or financial struggles. They know, they see, but until they act, they remain bound by the very patterns they've identified. Knowledge without movement creates frustration, even despair, because it reveals the chains without breaking them. Action, however, takes the key of awareness and unlocks the future. This principle is true in every sphere. Leaders who are aware of corruption but refuse to act allow decay to spread. Communities that see injustice but remain silent let oppression thrive. On the other hand, those who match awareness with action alter the course of history. They refuse to stay still once their eyes have been opened, and their actions birth movements that ripple through generations. Awareness gives you vision, but action gives you victory. Awareness hands you the map, but action takes you on the journey. Awareness opens the door, but action walks you through it. One without the other is incomplete. Together, they form the pathway from captivity to freedom, from cycles to change, from seeing to truly living.